I am Whitney Scherer, and I'm one of the organizers of the Arlington Author Salon, and I am so delighted to see this packed room. We're making it warm in here with all of our joy and our bodies, because outside it is quite hellish. So it is. I'm much happier to be in here with you. So we have three fantastic writers tonight. We have Marjane Kamali, Joan Ligant, and Aube Ray-Lescure, and they are going to be reading on the theme of exile and belonging, and their work touches on that theme in really interesting ways. And I think this is such a great lineup, and I love all of their work so much, and I can't wait to have them share it with you. For those of you who haven't come to one of these events before, this is a reading series with a twist. Each writer will have a 15-minute slot, which they can kind of do whatever they want. Typically, writers do a reading, and then they have something else that has to kind of touch on one of the other senses. Sometimes there's food, a smell, music, video, all sorts of different things have happened over the years, and it's always really fun to see people's work come alive in a different way. We will have an open Q&A at the end of the program. So each of the writers will read, and then at the end, so hold your questions for all of them, think about your questions while they're reading, and then we'll bring all three of them back up to the stage. They'll pass the mic back and forth, and you can ask your questions at that time. I want to thank, as always, our wonderful hosts here at Kickstand, Kickstand Cafe, and Emily, the owner. Who worked extra hard tonight because we're all freezing our butts off, and so they were like frantically making hot drinks for everybody, so thank you so much. I also want to thank my co-organizer, Anjali Midarduva, right over here, and also Sarah Regan, who is our co-organizer from the library just up the street, and we could not do it without you, and also ACMi, who come and film this for us, put it online when it's over, so if you want to relive the magic, you can. And when we send out the emails and information about the salon, we'll let you know when that's available to look at. I'd also like to thank our event partner, the Arlington Libraries Foundation, who provides funding and crucial support for the salon. The Arlington Libraries Foundation is the primary fundraiser for the Robbins and Fox branch libraries and is dedicated to helping open the doors to all who are curious, creating an inclusive space for the Arlington community, and ensuring the library's future as the cornerstone of the community for generations to come. Books are for sale tonight from all three authors. They're sold by Mike from the Book Rack, our wonderful local bookstore, and he will be hanging out right over here. You can buy the books at the end of the night. The authors have pens and are very excited to sign them for you if you so wish. And so with that, I will get us started. So our first reader tonight is going to be Aube Ray-Lescure. Aube is a French-Chinese-American writer. She grew up between Provence, northern China, and Shanghai, and graduated from Yale University in 2015. She is the co-author and translator of 2 books on Chinese politics and economics. Aube's debut novel, River East, River West, is published by William Morrow HarperCollins in the US and Duckworth in the UK, and has been shortlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, woohoo, and the Maya Angelou Book Award. Woohoo. I was like, that's also really cool. Her fiction and creative nonfiction have appeared or are forthcoming in Granta, Guernica, LitHub, Electric Literature, The Millions, WBUR, and more. Her essay, At the Bend of the Road, was selected for Best American Essays 2022. Here's Aube.
Thank you, Whitney, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me okay? I might need to stoop a little. Oh. Okay. I'm not tech savvy, sorry.
And you're tall for heels.
I know. Perfect. Yeah, I think, yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this very cold evening. I think before I read a little excerpt from my book, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Aube. I grew up between France and China because I was raised by a single mom who was a lifelong expatriate to China, and also a French woman. She traveled to China in the 1980s, right after the Reform and Opening era, so after the Cultural Revolution, and Mao's death. Deng Xiaoping took over and opened up the country to foreigners. And since today was Jimmy Carter's funeral at the National Cathedral, it feels like also a time to mention in China, that was an era where reestablishing relations with the US, with the West, led to pretty big changes within the country, which had been sealed off for decades by that point. So by the 1980s, the first waves of foreigners were coming into China to a population who had no contact with Westerners really for a very long time. So with that context in mind, I'll also tell you that I lived in northern China on and off throughout my life, and most notably in the 2000s, I moved back there with my mother in order to be with my father. And we lived in this very melancholy seaside city called Dalian. And I remember we would swim a lot in the ocean. We would take a lot of long walks by the coast. And both of my parents kept on returning to this one song that really marked me as a child. They weren't huge listeners of music, but this was the one song that I could tell moved them deeply and held some kind of magic on them. And so it's no wonder that it did make its way into my book and into this chapter I'm about to read you. So here we are in 1985 in the Chinese seaside city of Qingdao. On most days, Lu Fang swam for over 2 hours. On this windless August afternoon, the waves were clement, and he went out farther than usual in the Yellow Sea. The clear water revealed a school of jellyfish gliding a few meters below him, unhurried. They wouldn't sting unless threatened. He had his lane, and the jellyfish had theirs. In the winter, he swam for shorter periods. Men who grew up by the northern coastline knew how to plunge into the cold ocean, bracing against the icy waves. The best swimmers were rotund, insulated like seals. Lu Fang didn't have an ounce of excess meat on his body. His shoulders had broadened with years of daily exercise. The muscles in his back were strong and tight. He was far from the coast. He knew it was behind him, Mount Lao rising from the horizon. He always swam straight into the sea, far enough that humans or structures blurred into the sand and hills, as far as he could estimate the half-life of his strengths to be. The sea wasn't a border. Lu Fang had grown up on a river in Liaoning province, where the Yalu River divided North Korea to the east and China to the west. Guards at Chinese military outposts along the Yalu watching tightly for river crossers. The North Koreans came at night. They said that a defector's family, close and distant, would be executed. When he was 8, on his morning walk to school, Lu Fang saw a man in rags throw himself into the Yalu River, swimming towards China in a frenzied crawl. There was a sound of 2 quick gunshots, and the man's body was swallowed into the fold of the brown current. North of Harbin, a river separated China and Russia. Mongolia, Kazakhstan, those were land borders, more westward than he'd ever been. Narrow lines you could not cross. But the sea wasn't a border, and no one was here to stop you from swimming out a little farther each day. The only border here was a limitation of his own body. He turned and began swimming back towards shore. The rocks on Dali Beach were a popular gathering place for young people. Green glass bottles in hand, they waited for nightfall in their white button-downs, most of them students from the university. As Lu Fang swam closer to shore and the rocks came into focus, he saw the yellow hair. A dot of yellow in a cluster of black, unmistakable. 50 strokes forward, and Lu Fang could see it was a woman, a foreign woman. He'd left his backpack against the rocks, not far from the group of young people and the foreign woman. He draped his towel around his waist as he changed into dry pants. A guitar was lazily strummed. A few voices joined together in an English song. Already, he could tell which voice was a woman's. Though she had a smoker's rasp, the words rolled into the music with silver ease. After Lu Fang changed, he sat against the rocks and lit a cigarette. He would not be a gawker, but he wanted to listen. He'd heard the song they were singing on the radio before and understood pieces of the lyrics. It doesn't matter much to me. Let me take you down. The little English he could remember was rusty, though he always kept a Chinese-English dictionary on his desk. He'd learned some new words: tanker, straight, load. When the cigarette burned to a stub, he allowed himself another look at the woman. She was young, laughing with her mouth closed. Lu Fang eviscerated the cigarette against the rock. At 36, he was too old to be one of the university students with their beers and guitar. The yellow-haired foreigner's eyes briefly met his and looked away and phased, like someone accustomed to being stared at. A male student handed her a new bottle of Qingdao beer. She searched around for an opener, which disturbed the guitar playing. Finally, the student who'd handed her the beer took it back and opened the bottle with his teeth. Lu Fang reflexively touched his own lips. The foreigner stood up, held the bottle's thin neck, and drank without breathing until the liquid leaked and dripped down her chest. The students all watched and cheered. When she finished, the foreigner wiped her mouth and looked straight at Lu Fang, then sat back down. Or he thought she looked at him. It was getting dark. After that, they started singing Qiyu's 1979 hit, Olive Tree. A drifter keeps seeing an olive tree in her dreams. Lu Fang had heard the songwriter originally intended the drifter to dream about a little gray donkey. That wouldn't be the same, he thought. Olive trees were not meant for China. They could appear only in dreams, and one had to be content for even this brief apparition. When the woman's yellow hair melted into the darkness, Lu Fang stood and walked towards the bus stop to head home.
Thank you so much, Obe. That was really lovely, and left me with a lot of questions about music and your own writing, which I think has a musical quality to it too. So I appreciate that. There is one seat in the very front. If anybody who is standing feels like sneaking up here, actually, really, there's two seats, actually. All right. Next, we have Joan Ligant. Joan is the author of 3 books of fiction. Her latest, Displaced Persons Stories, won the New American Fiction Prize. The judge was Weike Wang. Her other books are An Hour in Paradise Stories, winner of the PEN New England Book Award and the Wallant Award, finalist for the National Jewish Book Award, and a Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers pick, and a novel, Wherever You Go. Formerly a lawyer, Joan has taught writing at Harvard, Oklahoma State, and Cornish College in Seattle. For 5 years, she was the visiting writer at Bar Ilan University outside Tel Aviv, where she also gave talks at schools across the country on American literature and culture under the auspices of the U.S. Embassy, and was a volunteer ESL teacher for African refugees and asylum seekers in Tel Aviv, experiences that have made their way into her fiction. A recipient of an artist grant from the Massachusetts Cultural Council and fellowships at MacDowell and Yaddo, Joan lives in Newton. She began writing fiction at age 40. Joan.
So can you hear me well enough? Okay. So age 40 was last week, so not really. So this is a collection of short stories that I'm going to talk about a little. Half of the stories are set in Israel, which I think we've all been reading about in the papers. So as you heard, I lived in Israel for 2 periods of my life. In the late 70s and early 80s, I was there for 3 years. And then most recently, I was a visiting writer at the university mentioned for 5 years. And during that time, I was also what you call a target of opportunity for the State Department. Sounds really nefarious, but what it is if you have any kind of a background or aptitude skill in something that is of interest to the State Department in the country you're in, they often ask you to do programs. So the State Department throughout the Middle East supports a lot of English language learning, American culture, American literature, and things that support democracy and civil rights. So I gave courses in American protest literature and summer programs in civil rights and things like that. And I was also a volunteer ESL teacher for African refugees and asylum seekers, as you heard. At the time, there were 50,000 African refugees who had made their way to Israel. They walked, essentially, across the continent. They came from places like Darfur and Eritrea, countries where they were escaping civil war and famine and persecution. And they made their way through the Sinai of Egypt without getting killed or taken for ransom. They would make their way into Israel. So I was a volunteer ESL teacher in a center that was supporting this community. And the reason I mention it is that their stories, some of their material made their way into my stories, mainly because it offered me an opportunity to meet people in communities throughout the country that I otherwise would not have so easily been able to meet. And this also illuminated for me the state of Israel. Israel is a small country. It's the size of New Jersey. There are about 8 million citizens of Israel. And yet it is a vast checkerboard of lots of populations. You know, there's obviously the Arab sector, and that's Christian Arabs and Muslim Arabs, Druze with a D. Those are folks who live up in the north. That's an offshoot of Islam up on the Syrian and Lebanese border. They're Bedouin in the south. In the Jewish Israeli community, there's Jews from the Middle Eastern countries, from Western countries, more recently a lot of Jews from France who came to escape anti-Semitism. And there are a lot of foreign workers, Thai workers, people from Nepal and from India, from the Philippines. So all of these communities make for a very vast and very interesting and complex society. So I didn't set out, the book here is called Displaced Persons, and I didn't set out to actually write a collection of stories about people who had been displaced, but I was writing about everyday life in Israel, and that was organically what emerged, stories of all kinds of people across the country. So The story, though, that I'm going to read to you from is actually about a different community. And these are the Russian Jews. This is a very huge Russian-Israeli diaspora in Israel. And they came about the same way Russian Jews arrived, or Russians, I should say, arrived everywhere. In 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union, and even before that, during Glasnost under Gorbachev in the late 80s, suddenly, it was the opposite of what you were describing. China was open to foreigners. Suddenly, the Russians could leave. They were not allowed to leave before that. And they left by the millions. So we know lots of Russians came to the United States, they went to Europe, and 1 million Russians went to Israel. And at the time, Israel had a population of about 5 million. So it became about 20% of the population. It was a tsunami, really, of new people and a whole different culture that arrived in Israel. And to give you a sense of the scale, the equivalent, they came over about an 8 year period. It would be the equivalent of the entire population of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands arriving in the United States, during that period to try to absorb themselves into the country. So this is what happened in Israel. And there were many wonderful things in the culture, as well as for the Russians who came. The orchestras swelled, as you might imagine. Russians came very highly educated in the sciences and engineering and math. But there were also cultural changes that came as well. It sounds like a stereotype, but there was more drinking, and there was also changes in the culture. The Russian community introduced pork into a society that had been governed largely by the kosher rules or halal rules, where nobody eats pork. So, there were lots of disruptions and changes. It's been a very dynamic and interesting period. So I'm going to read you an excerpt of a story in which an American, who is also herself somewhat displaced, this is a young American who has left the United States, is trying to, she calls herself haltingly lurching towards citizenship. She's trying to see if she can become a citizen of Israel herself. She's leaving behind a troubled situation in the past, and she encounters a Russian woman at the same time. What I have brought for everyone's enjoyment here, and which adds to the complication. This is chocolates. I would call them Russian chocolates, but they're from Ukraine, which is another, but I won't go into it, we don't have time, but I do have to tell you, since 2022 in February, when Putin invaded Ukraine, there have been tens of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians now who have also gone to Israel, which is another whole dynamic. So these are candies that are for the community, Russian-speaking, Ukrainian-speaking, made in Ukraine. And what I liked about it, and the reason I wanted to bring it apart from you, enjoying it while we go on, is that there are 3 languages in the back of this paper wrapper. One is Ukrainian, one is English, because the candies get exported to the United States, and the other one is Hebrew, because this gets exported to the people who buy it in Israel. And the title, though, of this translates to Kiev Nights. So that's the name of the candy. So you can pass it around if you like. I'm just going to take a sip of that. Yeah. Anyone's welcome to now. Okay. So I'm going to read to you from a story called Remittances. And remittances are payments that you receive as a foreigner in a country where you're temporarily living, and you send that money to your home country. So this is called remittances. And I'm going to read you 2 small sections of it. And it opens like this. I hear it everywhere, and this morning I finally read it in the English language daily I buy each morning at the kiosk on Tel Aviv's Ben Yehuda Street. Jewish is in Germany. An enterprising brewery in a small town in Bavaria is making the first officially kosher beer in the Old Reich, called King Solomon, the beer for the wise, the brewmeister says, even though all the beer in Germany is already de facto kosher. Hops, barley, yeast, malt, these are the only ingredients, the article says. So King Solomon's kashrut certification is a non-necessity, but the brewmeister wants it, he tells a reporter, because things Jewish are hip in Germany these days. The populace, especially the young, is drawn to it. King Solomon will make for good business. When I tell this to Aryeh, he sneers. This disgusts him, he tells me, even though his grandparents' wretched personal history also once disgusted him. This was before Israel's official embrace of the Holocaust. After decades of a barely disguised, silent national shame, how could they let themselves be led like sheep, et cetera, the country is finally able to look these old people in the eye. It wasn't always that way. When Aryeh was a kid, people used to tell the crones at the beach with numbers on their arms to cover themselves up. But now this latest news from the Deutschland makes him ill. He gets up from the table and he tells me to stop reading the English language dailies and learn better Hebrew already so I don't have to read that kind of drivel. I think it's probably in Haaretz too, I tell him, collecting the coffee cups from the table and carrying them to the sink. They cover the same things, you know, which I know because my paper is just an English translation of his. Well, I don't understand how anyone can call this newsworthy, Robin. He takes his plate to the counter. Shells of 3 hard-boiled eggs jostle on the glass. Enough already with Germany. We've been obsessing about them for 60 years. Who gives a shit what they think of Jews now? Who gives a shit what they think of anything? It has the fastest growing Jewish population in the world, I call to him on his way to the bathroom, where he'll brush his teeth before heading out the door to work. He's fastidious that way, likes to have his teeth brushed, his hands washed, hair combed just so before he walks out into the muddy soup of the street. It's the Yekka in him, his German-Jewish ancestry, though of course I won't tell him that. All those Jews from the FSU, I call. The second language in Berlin is practically Russian. Same as here, he calls back from the bathroom, the water running. Instinctively, I glance out the kitchen window at my neighbor's balcony. The Russian cleaning woman is beating a small rug on the railing. Puffs of dust billow up like little genies. All the Israelis in this building employ Russian women, Ludas and Arinas and Galinas, to clean their apartments. They're shocked to hear that I clean ours myself. It's not exploitation, they tell me in their excellent college-level English. The Russians were engineers or physicists or dentists back in Moscow, but if they don't speak the language, they can't find work. Think of it as giving an illiterate immigrant a job, they say. At that, I usually smile and end the conversation. They could just as well have been talking about me. And then there's another scene in which the narrator goes off to the ministry where she's supposed to process her citizenship application, and now she goes back to her apartment, so it picks up here. The Russian from my neighbor's balcony is sitting on a ledge outside her apartment building, clutching an overstuffed plastic bag that contains slippers and a house dress, things she wears for cleaning. A cracked black vinyl pocketbook is tucked in beside her. Everything all right? I ask in my rounded American Hebrew. It's nearly noon and feverishly hot. I've never seen her sitting outside before. She opens a palm and says something fast in Russian. A tiny Star of David glints on a thin gold chain around her neck. Apartment 3, floor 2, she manages in Hebrew. She has a customer in my building. But why is she outside? I fish for my keys. Does she not have a key? I ask, holding them up. Nobody home? Correct, she nods. Nobody home. Brassy gold caps glint on 2 of her upper teeth. So maybe she wasn't a mathematician or an astronaut or a dentist in the mother country. Maybe she's from Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan or one of those other long ridiculed stands. But still, I find her cleaning person status distressing. I don't like it, no matter what my smartly dressed Tel Aviv acquaintances say. Cham me'od, I say to her, to the woman in my simplest Hebrew, fanning myself to demonstrate in case she hasn't learned even the basics. Hot out here. Would you like to come to my apartment for a cold drink? I throw back the imaginary contents of an imaginary glass. I make pretend drinking noises. She tips her head, uncertain. She doesn't want to stand up her employer, but her employer is not home, and someone has made a mistake. I perform a series of gestures to get across that I will write her employer a note and leave it on her door. Then she can come out of the heat. Beseder, the woman says. All right. We take care of the note and walk the stairs in silence. In Aryeh's apartment, I bring her a glass of fresh grapefruit juice mixed with seltzer. She likes this, and I pour another one despite her protest. Refreshed, out of the blinding sun, she's quite attractive, about my mother's age. She even looks a little like my mother, who comes from a long line of Russian Jews. She waves away my offer to eat, folds her hands, and looks around. A husband, she inquires. Do I have a husband? No, I tell her, just a chaver, a boyfriend. She nods. And you, I ask? Husband? Ugh, She waves away the question. From a melange of Hebrew and facial expressions and hand gestures, I deduced that the husband was no good, that he came with her to the country, but soon disappeared, leaving her with a problem daughter, a son who got into trouble, and a couple of grandchildren. She lives in Bat Yam and is tired all the time. What did she do back in Russia, I asked, pushing a plate of grapes in her direction. Ah, she makes a broad smile. Director, she beams and takes a grape. Director? You ran a business? Vigorous head shakes. Business. Same word in Hebrew as in English. No, no, not business. Director. She moves her hands like a symphonic conductor. Musical director? And I sing a little la la la. No, no, no. She floats her fingers toward her face and holds her head high. Her hands are reddish and raw from detergents and scouring powders. Then I see it. Comedy and tragedy. The famous thespian masks. Ah! Theater director, I say. Kane, yes, yes. Shakespeare, Chekhov, Bernard Shaw. You directed Shakespeare? Bernard Shaw? She tips her head, she smiles, the actor taking a bow. Wow, that's some change, I offer in English. A theater person, and now you're cleaning houses for rich Israelis in North Tel Aviv. She smiles, I know she didn't understand, and murmurs something melancholy in Russian. And here I ask, you're also a director here? Because there's a huge Russian community. Surely they put on plays and other entertainments. She sighs. She is too tired, she says. She is telling me in her mix of tongues that it is not possible, that no one can work all day cleaning houses and then come home at night and inspire a fleet of desperate actors, that you can't feel fresh and energized after taking 3 buses to the city, then 3 more home, then coping with your difficult offspring and needy grandchildren. I don't understand a word, but I am certain that this is what she is saying. Life is full of problems, full of mistakes, regrets, but, and this doesn't have to be said, it's better here than it was back there. A knock at the door. We glance over. We both know who it is. The Russian sighs again and begins to collect her bags, the slippers, the house dress. The carriage turned into a pumpkin. Art, its pulls and potent demands, has vanished. She's the cleaning lady again. Oh, Robin, thank you. I got your note. The Israeli in her stylish pantsuit and impossibly high heels is breathless. I feel terrible keeping Tanya waiting. She pokes in her head. Tanya, she says loud in Hebrew as if the Russian were hard of hearing. I'm so sorry. I got caught up in traffic. She turns to me. Stuck behind a horse-drawn wagon, if you can believe it. One of those old men from Yaffo riding to the construction sites to collect the discards. Crazy Tel Aviv. The Russian pulls herself out of the chair, exhausted, though she hasn't even begun, and follows her employer out the door. Thank you.
Oh, that was so good. I was like lost in that story. Coming back to reality here. All right, so our third and final reader for the night is Marjan Kamali. Marjan was born in Turkey to Iranian parents, spent her childhood in Kenya, Germany, Turkey, Iran, and the United States. She holds degrees from UC Berkeley, Columbia University, and NYU. She is the 2022 recipient of the NEA Creative Writing Award. She is the author of The Lion Women of Tehran, The Stationery Shop, and Together Tea. Her novels have been translated into more than 20 languages. Marjan lives with her family in the Boston area. Welcome, Marjan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Whitney. And it's so great to be back at the Arlington Author Salon and to see all of you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Exile and belonging, I think, should just be engraved on my tombstone. And it's probably no coincidence. All of us have lived overseas, not in America. So in my case, I've lived in 7 countries and 5 continents. And the US is my 7th country, but when I was growing up, I definitely wanted to constantly find a sense of home. And in the end, I failed really finding that in a place. I found it in reading, in books. Ergo, I am a writer. I feel as though, even though I've tried to sort of pretend that, writing is my homeland, truly we all know it's actually your family that you live with. So I write a lot about Iran. So 3 novels, they take place in Iran and the United States. Obviously, I'm of Iranian heritage, and people assume that because I write a lot about Iran that I lived there a long time, but I didn't really. I only lived there between the ages of 2 and 5, and then again between 9 and 10 and a half. But that second segment was during a very pivotal time in Iran's history. It was right after the 1979 revolution, and it was during the first year and a half of the Iran-Iraq war. So it was a pivotal time in Iran's history. It was a pivotal time in my own history. It was a time when the rights of women were turned back, not years, but centuries. And in this third book, which I'd love to talk to you about tonight, In the Lion Women of Tehran, I cover that history, how Iranian women in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and in the 1970s saw an expansion of their rights, right to education, right to work, right to travel, right to vote. And then when a hard right fundamentalist regime took over, their rights were taken away. And it didn't happen overnight. It happened relatively slowly until it suddenly happened overnight. So a woman living in Iran today, if she's the age of 57 or above, knows that she grew up with all these rights that her daughters and her granddaughters don't have. It's a bitter pill to swallow. But don't worry, because all my books, even though there's a lot of sadness, there's a lot of healing. And I was told once that I write healing fiction, and that too should go on my tombstone. So I really loved that. So just a little bit of background about this book. After The Stationery Shop came out, which is my second novel, I started writing the next book, and I was more than 100 pages in. It was about 4 moms living in the suburbs of Boston whose firstborns were applying to college, and they were neurotically obsessed about where these kids were going to go to school. I used my imagination. I do live in Lexington, and I was surrounded by very competitive families. But as I was writing this book, the pandemic started and lockdown began. And it was, do you remember 2 weeks to slow the spread? 2 weeks, yes. Well, I started to panic that we were all going to die, and I didn't know what would happen. We were in lockdown. So I turned to Instagram, and as I was scrolling, yes, as one does, and as I was scrolling Instagram, I came across these posts from a friend of mine. And she was my friend, not just on Instagram, but she had been my best friend in Iran. During that time that I told you about, during that pivotal time when I was there in 4th grade and half of 5th grade. And we had done everything together. We had played together almost every day. We had done our homework together. I knew her mom, she knew my mom. But she was a source of great comfort during what was a difficult time, because we were also girls living in this increasingly autocratic regime and during the war. So as I come across her posts, I got this visceral sense of our friendship. I could remember the texture of our friendship. And it struck me again how these friends we make when we're young really shape us, and their influence on our lives lasts, even if the friendship itself doesn't. All these decades later, here I was now an author, telling stories in America, and there she was, working for a human rights organization in Iran. So I knew what I really wanted to write was the story of a broken friendship. And I set aside my 100+ pages and I started to write The Line Women of Tehran. And in this book, two girls named Ellie and Homa meet when they're 7 years old. They come from very different stations in life, but they form a fast friendship. We see them go through the joys of childhood. We see them go through the ups and downs of adolescence. They go off to university together, but then the friendship is ruptured when one of them betrays the other. But don't worry, because apparently I write healing fiction. Decades later, they reconnect in America. And all along, one of them, Homa, fights tirelessly for Iranian women to be free. I deliberately made the two girls my mom's age. They're born in 1943 because I wanted to show the changes that happened in Iran for women, for girls in the 50s, 60s, 70s. I do love it when a reader writes to me and says, yeah, I love that you wrote your experience. They assume I was born in 1943, nothing wrong with that. I was more than halfway done with this book when a real woman named Mahsa Jina Amini in Iran was arrested for wearing improper hijab. Some of you remember. She was later killed. She died under police custody. It sparked a whole slew of protests where women and girls poured into the streets because they were so sick of having their lives dictated by fundamentalist men. And like so many people, I watched from afar with hope and then heartbreak as those protests were quashed. But the bravery of those women was astounding. They had many male allies. I don't want that to go unsaid. It was a joint effort. And I knew I wanted to honor them. So in The Line Women of Tehran, those of you who've read it, you know that the ending was in part written by real life events. Okay, so I'm going to read. I normally read from a part that's very emotional and good for reading from, but it involves a humongous fire. And in respect of what's going on in LA and all our friends in California and many of my own family members, I'm not going to read that. I'm going to read from the very beginning, and you don't need any context because you would just pick it up and read from here. Chapter 1, December 1981. I stood on the lacquered floor, a small woman in black with a rectangular name badge on my chest. My coiffed, contented look was calculated so I'd appear not just satisfied, but quietly superior. In America, I'd learned the secret to being a successful salesperson was to act like one of the elite, as if spritzing perfume on customers' blue-veined wrists was doing them a favor. A sea of haughty New Yorkers swerved to avoid my spray. Thank God for the more down-to-earth women, the cooks and bakers coming up to the first floor from the basement home goods section. Speaking of cooks and bakers, that is my sensory for you tonight. Taste. We're passing around some Persian pastries because there's a lot of food in this book. Orange, lily, jasmine, and rose notes nestled in the lines of my palms and the fiber of my clothes. Look at you, Ellie. Soon you'll take over this whole brand. I better watch my back. My friend and coworker Angela, returning from her cigarette break, sidled up and whispered in my ear. The scent of her Hubba Bubba gum couldn't hide the smoke on her breath. I shivered at the reek of tobacco. The bitter, sour notes would forever remind me of one long ago night in Iran, the night when an act of betrayal changed the entire course of my friendship with Homa and both of our lives. From the moment I'd read Homa's letter last night, I'd been a wreck. I batted away Angela's compliments, said I wasn't doing all that well, really, and that I had a headache because I hadn't eaten all day. I just might faint, I added, with a touch of melodrama. It was a relief when Angela was whisked away by a needy customer. My mother always said the envy of others invites the evil eye to cast doom on us. She'd often told me that being perceived as too competent, happy, or successful could summon misfortune. I knew belief in the powers of other people's jealousy and the jinxing of an evil eye needed to be cast off. But at the age of 38, in the middle of that massive Manhattan department store, I was still unwittingly beholden to superstition. The truth of who I was could not be escaped, nor could the flaw I had spent years trying to quash and erase. The guilty one had always been me. All right. Well, I'd like to do something else here at the Arlington Author Salon. I've never done this at a reading until tonight, but I'm in the mood to read for you the ending. And it's not a spoiler because I'm not going to tell you whose voice this is in, and I'm only going to read a tiny part. But I'm in the mood because I'm in the mood to express these things. So I won't tell you who this is, for those of you who haven't read the book, because that would be an utter spoiler. However, now, with the protests after Massa's death and the country recoiling in grief, I feel the rage continuously. I feel it in every limb of my body, in every millimeter of my blood. Of course, I go out with the young women and men protesting night after night. How could I stay home? Let them beat me with their batons. Let them bruise my body to a pulp. Let them shoot and kill me. For a lifetime we have fought. We have fought and fought and fought. We want to be free. We want to be equal. We want to be able to live our lives. I recently read a theory about ocean waves. This theory says that while to our eyes waves appear suddenly on the shore, their abruptness is an illusion. Waves begin their journey thousands of miles out at sea. They accumulated shape and power from winds and undersea currents for ages. And so, when you see the women screaming in Iran for their rights, please remember that the force and fury of our screams have been gathering power for years.
Each of you is multilingual, and so this is a question that I always ask because I experience it myself and I'm curious about other people's experience. How do your different languages, do you think, influence your writing?
Okay, I will go first. I'm holding the microphone. When I'm writing the scenes that take place during a moment where the characters are not speaking English, in my brain, I hear it in the other language. So I hear it, for example, in Persian. And in my brain, that's what they're saying, but then I transcribe it. I translate as I write. I'm doing this because I do write longhand, and I appreciate everybody here because I teach undergrads, and they're just like, what? You hold a pen? I'm like, yes, there is this thing called a pen, and we write. So yeah, I just transcribe it, and especially when you're writing by hand, by the time it goes from your brain down your arm, through your hand across the page, there's some more time than when you're just typing. So then it comes out in English. But in my mind, it's in the other language.
So I first should qualify that I'm not fluent in Hebrew. I have poor Hebrew. I speak like a kindergartner. I have no past or future. It's very Zen. I can't do the future tense or the past tense. But I do channel characters, and I hear them speaking in Hebrew in my head, and I tend to convey it through the syntax in English, which is what I do, sort of tortured in syntax. And when I read to you, you could hear accents. I hear the accents myself, too. But the other thing I was going to say is that I'm sure you have the same experience. In every language, I have a slightly different persona, which is dictated by the language. And one of the examples I often would give, I'd be in a hotel room in Israel, and you'd see something about, in English, please fold the towels. And then you'd see it in German. It would be like 9, sentences long. And then you'd see it in Hebrew, 2 words, fold towels. So it's like, there's a persona that goes with the language too, that dictates part of the story and the characters.
Thank you. English is my third language. French and Chinese are my maternal tongues. But I wrote this book in English because by the point I was writing it, I felt like my dominant language, the one I was consuming, the one I was living in, is English. But I do think having different mother tongues affects our writing on a subliminal, stylistic level, where the cadence, the rhythm, even the diction might feel a little bit unexpected in a delightful way, because I am not that familiar with American idioms or familiar phrases an English writer might use. So I think for me, I try to see it as something that opens up vaster possibilities because of a lack of familiarity with what I call volunteer phrases. And I also think, Marjan, like what you said, when I write about Chinese characters speaking Chinese to each other in China, it does really matter a lot to me to not do what a lot of expat writers do, which is take on characters of a particular country in a particular setting in a particular tongue and just write it in this totally westernized way that makes it clear that the writer is just projecting. And so I try really hard to cross-check in my head, what would they be saying in Chinese to each other? Does this sound authentic? And I think that matters a lot, especially when it comes to writing about a culture that's partially one's own or that one's own, but there's more to the story.
I don't think I need a mic, right? Can you talk a little bit about home? Like, what does home mean to you? Psychologically, geographically, thematically? One of you said it's in books. Does it reside with parents? Does it reside with siblings? Does it reside with the culture? Or a historic place, way to go? What does home mean to you?
I'll start since I'm holding the mic. I think I still haven't found a home, and I think that's maybe a mark of growing up across continents and always being an outsider in some ways. I think for me, China is the place that was my home for so many years, but I was always identified as not fully Chinese when I lived there. When I go back now, it breaks my heart to be spoken to in English because people assume I'm a foreigner, and that's fair enough. In many ways, of course, I am, and that creates a sense of alienation. When I'm in France, people assume French is a very homogeneous country with a lot of problems when it comes to acceptance of heterogeneous or immigrant communities. So when I go there, I feel immediately like an outsider. And I think for me, home is a place where maybe it is the US in the sense that I can walk down the street and not be immediately made feel like she comes from elsewhere. And I think, parts of the US are diverse enough where you can just walk into a room and not immediately feel like the local population is identifying you as an other. And I think in a more global sense, just having that feeling makes a place, feel more like home, like you belong.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I don't really have a home when it comes to a country, though I guess the US, to be fair. But I recently discovered that I have a bit of a Pollyanna syndrome. So you could say I don't really have a home, but then I think everywhere is my home. So I used to live in Australia, and I recently visited Australia, and I was like, I'm home. But of course I wasn't. But in my head, all these places are my home. I also think home is a little bit overrated. Maybe I'm just jealous of people who do have a real home. But like I said, I think it's really your family. Wherever your family is your home. Is that too cheesy? But it's true.
I have a obviously different history. I didn't live as a child in another country, but I guess my situation is a little different in the sense that I went to Israel in my 20s and I wanted to stay. it became kind of an ideological home for me. I'm Jewish, and I felt very attached to the Jewish history of Israel. But I came back reluctantly. So I have a son now who lives in Israel. He's a video photographer. He's a war. He's following the war as a video correspondent. And so I'm kind of one foot in one country and one foot in the other. And that's, how I've lived for a long time. So I just make my peace with that.
Can you talk a little bit about your writing process, how you develop your characters, their voice, and plot around the book?
Okay, so the writing process, the characters, and the voice. You have 4 hours, 12 hours. Yeah, there's a lot of questions, but I'll just tell you briefly. I'm a lot like Marjan. I write by hand. I don't plan anything. I don't plot anything. I also write novels. I can't. I've tried it all. It's kind of DOA. If I do it that way, it's a little too paint by number. So I kind of grope is really the way I plan. I just have to pay attention. I like to read George Saunders, who talks a lot about this, and he says, you just stay with a sentence and you let the sentences pull you in and get out of your own way. So I do that. I don't actually develop the characters. I listen for them and see what they say and do. That's kind of my process in that regard. I'm pretty disciplined. I write as often as I can. I think maybe I'll, stop there for the moment. And I try to let the plot emerge from the characters. Otherwise, I put cheesy plots in to kind of, fake it. So that doesn't work. So I just kind of have to be sort of close to the words and let the words pull me in.
Yeah, my process is similar. I don't plan the novels ahead of time. So for the first draft, it's very much free writing, a lot longhand, and I let the characters decide what the story is. I do go really deep into character development, so I write journals in the voice of the main characters, and that ends up with the writer, having much more material than you'll ever need. Like, you'll use maybe 20% of what you wrote, but that's okay, because it's like the tip of the iceberg shows in the finished book. But the fact that you, the author, know all that comes through. And I think a long time ago, I just learned to embrace that true writing is incredibly inefficient. We can be efficient in our day jobs, but writing is inefficient. It's messy. It takes forever. There's a lot of crying. And, you just have to embrace all of that. So once I have a first draft, though, then I become a bit more of a plotter. And then I think to myself, okay, how can I reorganize this so that it has the maximum emotional impact on the reader? And then I become much more sort of meticulous and strict about everything. But the first draft is a lot of fun because anything goes.
I'm actually primarily a nonfiction writer and an essayist, I would say. So when I think about the writing process, it's often about the real life material that I can draw from, whether that's personal experience or social commentary from dynamics that I observed. And I often, once I have the material and experience, something that happened to me, something from my past, I will then determine, would this work better as fiction? Would this work better as nonfiction? How long does it need to be? And I tend to decide that when it needs to be long, it's better as fiction. It's better as a novel. If it's really short, oftentimes an essay will do the job in capturing what I'm trying to capture. And with this book, it shouldn't be any surprise that it's highly autobiographical. It's a cliche of debut novelists that they write about the first 15 years of their lives. But I think, at first, I just wanted to write a book about these observations I had growing up in China, and writing a memoir felt so pretentious and a no-go. And an essay collection didn't quite work either. And I turned towards the novel form, fiction, which is so incredibly difficult, and thought, all right, might as well get on the fiction train and at least see, as I learn to turn real people into characters, as I learn to defamiliarize the familiar, can there be more drama, more possibility, better storytelling, and more resonant emotional truth than the material in my real life?
Yes. I'm curious to know how your works have impacted other people. Like what you have been delighted or maybe surprised about how your works have impacted other people.
I have to think. So.
You know, it's super rewarding after you spend years alone in a room making these people up to then have the characters out into the world and have readers write to you and message you and say, this reminded me of my friendship, this reminded me of my family, this made me want to read more books again, or this made me want to write again. But I'm going to share a story with you that's very specific. The Stationery Shop, my second book, is a love story, and it's about two lovers who meet when they're 17 and then they're separated for 60 years, but then they reconnect. They don't, okay, I won't say the spoiler, but at a reading actually in Santa Monica, which is very sad to think what's happening there right now, this summer, a young woman raised her hand and she said, after I read The Stationery Shop, I cried and cried, and then I contacted my first love, and we just celebrated our anniversary. And I was like, okay, thank you, and please name your firstborn after me. So that was super, super rewarding.
That's an interesting question you asked, how, since we can intuit a lot of people's minds as fiction writers, but not necessarily the readers, because we have to make it up. But short of making up an answer to your question, I think that the way I would understand it is I think the job of the fiction writer is to tell the truth. And you mentioned emotional truth, which always sounds, odd because we do it through invented people and in made up scenarios and all that. But the goal is to tell emotional truth. So to me, I just finished, my book came out in June. I went on this fall. I was at a lot of places talking. And really the most rewarding thing is when people tell me that I hit the emotional truth of some situation. So I have stories, half of the stories in the book are set in Israel, the ones I was talking about. The other half are set in the States among Jewish families. And they involve things like mental illness and family separation and things like that. And people would say, you told, how did you know, or whatever, but you told the truth about something. And to me, that's the greatest reward. If someone feels like, and I think we feel that way as readers, that's how I respond. If I feel like a truth has been told me, and we all have that, right? We put down books that we're not told anything we didn't already know, or that didn't really resonate as truthful. So to me, that's the best, that's the goal, and that's what you hope to achieve as a fiction writer, I think. Yeah.
I have an answer now, thankfully. I set out to write this book as this biting satire and critique of expat culture in modern Asia. And then it later became so much more than that. It became a story of family. It became a story of going from a place of cynicism to acceptance and empathy. And I kind of forgot the impetus of, having a social mission, generating a reckoning amongst the expat community, or 5 expats, or even one. That would be nice. And I think I have been gratified to hear expats who have had experience living in China or living in Asia tell me that this book helped them, question the prevalent attitudes or culture within expat communities. And by that I mean, when I was growing up in China, kind of straddling the local Chinese family school communities and the expat world, I was often shocked by the indifference at best and condescension at worst that people in the expat bubble had towards the local Chinese society. And we were reading a lot of books about colonialism in the international school that I went to, like Empire of the Sun or Passage to India, and it was squarely treated as historical texts, while a lot of people in the school were living in gated communities where the only people they interacted with who were Chinese on a day-to-day basis were their chauffeur, their household staff, or service industry people. But no one was talking about how this mode of, colonial segregated living very much applied to modern expatriate communities in China. And we weren't reading anything like that. So I thought, if my book has been able to generate that kind of reckoning and recognition amongst, any number of expats, that I feel like the original mission has been fulfilled in some ways.
We have time for one more question. There is a final question. There's a hand up. Oh, I see 2 hands. Okay.
What's something that surprised you that you didn't see coming at the start?
What's something that surprised you that you didn't see coming?
Something that surprised you that
It's just about all of it because I don't plan ahead of time. So as I started to write the first draft, if you have that process, it's like, oh, is that who you are? That's nice. And oh, he dies? Okay. It's all a surprise in the first draft, really. So kind of almost the entire book.
Yeah, I would second that. It's all a surprise. And I actually see that as the process is torturous. You don't know what you're doing for a very long time. But I like to remind myself great words from Robert Frost, who said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. And even better, he said, no tears for the writer, no tears for the reader. So you're surprised, but you want to be surprised. At least I do, because then I know it went somewhere else, somewhere deeper. And often I like to say the story knows more than I do. I don't know what it's going to be, so if I follow the story, I'm going to go somewhere else, that it took me invariably to a better or deeper or broader understanding than I had on my own. So that's the positive of the surprise.
I think for me, the surprise, as someone who never wrote fiction before this will sound cheesy a little bit, but falling in love was a character that is pure creation, and that I think it's a marvelous feeling to have as a writer when someone who you created, who's really not necessarily based on a real life person you already love or have emotions about, truly this entity is a creation, and you start seeing them and developing feelings and emotions for them as a real human being. That's when something magical is occurring in the text, and perhaps that's when you know that the reader might be able to fall in love with a character in the same way. And for a nonfiction writer, what a delight it was to discover this feeling.
Nobody's committed to a mental.
Not yet.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. This is really great. And thank you all for coming. The next Salon is actually our 10th anniversary. Woohoo! And it is on April 10th. So mark your calendars now. We're going to have some sort of fun surprise. It will be a surprise. We don't know what's coming. So a surprise to us as well. Yes. Please relax, enjoy, buy some books, get them signed, and thanks again. Take care.
ACMi productions are only made possible with your support. Visit patreon.com/ACMi to learn how you can help.